What's fascinating about the 1909 determination at Versailles is Palestine isn't even claimed by the Arabs at that time. We get to 1920, the San Remo Conference, and that's what granted the British a mandate over Palestine with the aim of encouraging immigration and settlement of Jews and the establishment of the Jewish national home. That's what they were mandated to do, and they worked against it for throughout their whole administration. It's the British officials that instigate the Arab riots in Palestine. The rioters demand an end to Jewish immigration. That's what they failed to acquit themselves honorably of this mandate. And they installed the most anti-Semitic leader as the Grand Mufti in Jerusalem, and the League of Nations ratifies the British mandate over Palestine with the aim of rebuilding the national home. And but then Churchill writes a white paper which creates Transjordan, what we know east of Jordan, taking 78% of the land that was allocated for Israel and to create this state of Jordan. And finally, of course, I won't go through all these. Hitler ultimately comes to power in Germany. Then we have the Nuremberg laws. These are signed by Adolf Hitler after one of his mass rallies. The laws provided the legal framework of stripping Jews of their rights as human beings, the first of which was called the Law of Safeguarding German Blood and Honor. This leads the groundwork for ultimately the death camps and so on. And this leads to the murder of the 6 million Jews that we're all well familiar with. And it went even the inability of the survivors, even after the war, to return to their home when Germany was defeated in 1945. And this injustice rallies the world's support to create ultimately the state of Israel. And the campaign of violence continues. In 1937, the Peel Commission of Britain asserts that the Jewish national home cannot be built in Palestine, and it recommends that a repartition of Palestine into a tiny Jewish state, 5% of the total area. What's fascinating is this plan is obviously rejected by the Jews. It's even rejected by the Arabs. When you study this history, one of the things that leaps out at you is what Abba Eban meant with his famous statement. He says, the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And then there's the Munich Conference and the betrayal of Czechoslovakia. And you need to understand the background. I'm sorry I can't include it in this brief review, but you need to understand the background of the Czechoslovakia to understand what's really happening in Israel today. And most of you know the history, I think, since the Second World War. I'm deliberately going to skip through this quickly because I'm running tight on time here. Palestinian National Charter was in 1964. Realize that was when they had the West Bank. It was chartered to wipe out the rest. They're now, and so you really need to understand the ideology that lies behind that. And the Six-Day War, I think most of you are familiar with. We don't have to go through all that. You'll hear a lot about the resolutions 242 and 338. These are two Security Council documents following the Arab-Israeli wars, called for sides to renounce the acquisition of the territory. In other words, Israel, give back what you earned in the wars. And so it's, again, one-sided things. There's the Yom Kippur War, the Camp David Accord, I think most of you are familiar with. Let me skip through this because it's the clock is ticking here, and I want to get to more immediate concerns to you and I. And we had one memorandum after another. Needless to say, they were overly ambitious. They were based on a false premise. They were based on the premise that you could get peace by reducing the border of Israel when the enemies made it clear that nothing less than the extinction of the state was what they're after. So all these were fated to a failure. Let's back up a little bit. Since up till 1990, the Security Council and the UN passed 175 resolutions total. Do you realize that 55% of those were directed against Israel? The fact that 55% were even about Israel is astonishing. The UN has more problems to deal with. 97 of the 175 were directly resolutions against Israel. The General Assembly, during that period, passed 690 resolutions. 429 were directed against Israel, 62%. When you begin to understand the bias in the UN, you can begin to understand why Israel is not excited about having UN inspectors meddle within their problems. Let's take a quick look at their military. Their defense budget is 12% of their GDP, but they also get an additional $2 billion a year from U.S. military aid. They have about 173,000 active troops, but 425,000 reserves. They have about almost 4,000 tanks, U.S. made, and Israel made Merkavas. Merkava is the Hebrew word for chariot, by the way. So the vocabulary of prophecies are interesting. That's another study. But they have about 2,000 aircraft, most of them U.S., modified U.S. for their, among the modifications are the altimeters, because they have to fly below sea level, interestingly enough. They have about 6,000 naval troops, 4 German-made submarines, which incidentally each one carries 8 cruise missiles with nuclear weapons. And those German-made subs, 3 or 4 were funded by the German government for them as reparations. We believe they have about 300 nuclear weapons. They have over 200 multiple rocket launcher type vehicles. They have over almost 1,300 surface air missiles with a 1,000-kilometer range. They do have chemical, biological, and, by the way, neutron bomb capabilities. Now, if you put this all together, if you take Iraq, Iran, Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, they have apparently about 4 million troops altogether. And that gives Israel, the benefit of the doubt, they have about 600,000. So there's they're facing a 6-to-1 odds. And if you remember the story of Gideon, those odds aren't big enough for God to really demonstrate his superiority. So we'll see what happens here. Tanks about 4 times, aircraft about 3 times, but let's, I want you to, while we're trying to get a perspective here, I want you to name this country. This country has 7,000 regular active duty personnel with about 3,000 reserves, 300,000 reserves. They have 8 standing Army divisions, 20 Air Force Navy wings. They have about 13 strategic missile submarines, 3,000 nuclear warheads on about 200 missiles, 500 ICBMs and 2,000 warheads, and about 4 aircraft carriers and about 120 surface combatant ships and submarines, and all the support for these. What country am I talking about? Is I talking about Russia? No, I'm not. China? No, I'm not. Great Britain? No. France? No. The U.S.? No. The problem is, this country no longer exists. It has vanished. What I listed up before are the American military forces that have disappeared since the 1992 election of Bill Clinton and Al Gore. This is out of Jane's Fighting Ships, the world standard for comparative military statistics. Sleep well, America. Now, there's another alliance that impacts the Middle East. That's the Sino-Magog alliance. In 1999, on its 50th anniversary, NATO redefined itself as a world police force. That not only frightened our adversaries, it made our allies nervous. That's what led to Kosovo and all that. In 2001, these adversaries formed a pact. Russia, China, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, they signed a pact specifically tailored to resist the hegemony of the United States. This Russia, China, and these nations and Israel, there's that little blue thing in the middle of the screen. They also are anti-Israel for lots of self-interested reasons. By the way, they've already practiced, Russia and China have practiced military operations